If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage, love, and adventure from the frontier days. The dusty main street of Willow Creek stretched like a brown ribbon under the scorching Arizona sun of 1873. Heat waves danced above the wooden boardwalks, distorting the view of the small frontier town that had sprung up around the silver mine. The stagecoach wheels creaked to a halt outside Murphy's General Store, sending up a cloud of red dust that settled slowly on everything within 50 feet. Eleanor Whitmore stepped down from the coach, her emerald traveling dress already wilted from the long journey from Philadelphia. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched her leather satchel, green eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces of the townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrival of Samuel Garrett's mail-order bride. The smell of horses, dust, and wood smoke filled her nostrils. Samuel Garrett emerged from the crowd, his polished boots clicking against the wooden planks. He was a man of considerable wealth in this small town, owning both the general store and a stake in the silver mine. His black suit was impeccable, his mustache precisely waxed, and his cold grey eyes appraised Eleanor like she was merchandise. He removed his hat with practiced courtesy, revealing thinning hair slicked back with pomade. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Welcome to Willow Creek. I trust your journey was not too arduous." His smile never reached his eyes, and Eleanor noticed how his gaze lingered on her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. The other townspeople watched the exchange with barely concealed curiosity and whispered comments. From the edge of the gathering, Thomas McKenna observed the scene with growing unease. The tall, broad-shouldered lumberjack had been watching Eleanor's correspondence with Samuel for months, ever since he'd accidentally seen one of her letters at the post office. Her gentle words and kind spirit had captured his heart, though he'd never dared to hope she might notice a simple woodsman like himself. Thomas's weathered hands clenched into fists as he watched Samuel's predatory smile. The lumberjack had worked these mountains for 5 years, his cabin nestled in a grove of towering pines where the air was clean and the only sounds were birdsong and the whisper of wind through the branches. He dreamed of sharing that peaceful sanctuary with someone who could appreciate its simple beauty. "Mr. Garrett," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Up close, she could see the hardness in Samuel's features, the way his lips pressed into a thin line when he thought no one was looking. This was not the kind, gentle man she'd imagined from his carefully crafted letters. The reality hit her like a physical blow, and she felt trapped between the dusty street and this stranger who expected to own her. Samuel gestured toward a waiting buggy, its leather seats gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Come, my dear. We have much to discuss before tomorrow's ceremony. Mrs. Henderson has prepared rooms for you at the boarding house." His tone brooked no argument, and Eleanor felt the weight of expectation from the gathered crowd. She had traveled so far, invested so much hope in this new beginning. As they walked toward the buggy, Eleanor's eyes met those of the tall man standing apart from the crowd. Thomas McKenna's rugged face was kind, his brown eyes filled with a concern that seemed genuine. Something in his expression made her heart skip, a flutter of recognition that had nothing to do with familiarity and everything to do with an inexplicable sense of safety and understanding. That evening, Eleanor sat in her small room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, staring out the window at the mountains that surrounded the town. The peaks caught the last rays of sunlight, painting them gold and purple against the darkening sky. She'd hardly touched the simple dinner of beans and cornbread, her stomach churning with anxiety about the morning's wedding ceremony. A soft knock interrupted her troubled thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Mrs. Henderson's kindly face. Instead, Samuel Garrett entered without waiting for permission, his presence immediately making the small room feel suffocating. He'd removed his jacket, and Eleanor could smell whiskey on his breath as he approached her chair by the window. "Tomorrow," "You'll be my wife," Samuel said, his voice thick with alcohol and expectation. "I've waited long enough for companionship, and I expect you to fulfill all the duties that entails." His hand reached out to touch her hair, and Eleanor jerked away, her heart pounding with fear and revulsion. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Please leave," Eleanor whispered, pressing herself against the window. "It's not proper for you to be here." But Samuel only laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. He moved closer, and Eleanor realized with growing horror that her pleas for propriety meant nothing to this man, who saw her as property he'd already purchased with his letters and promises. "Don't play the innocent with me," Samuel sneered. "You came here to be my wife, and I'm simply claiming what's mine a day early." His hands reached for her again, and Eleanor's scream pierced the night air. The sound echoed off the boarding house walls, surely waking every guest in the building. Samuel's face contorted with rage at her resistance. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, and the door burst open. Thomas McKenna filled the doorway, his massive frame backlit by the hallway lamp. His face was dark with fury as he took in the scene before him. "Get away from her," he growled, his voice carrying the promise of violence. Samuel stepped back, his bravado crumbling in the face of the lumberjack's obvious strength. "This is none of your business, McKenna," Samuel sputtered, straightening his vest and trying to regain his composure. "She's my intended bride, and what happens between us is private." But his voice shook, and Eleanor could see the fear in his eyes as he faced the towering woodsman. The contrast between the two men was stark in the lamplight. Thomas stepped fully into the room, his presence immediately making Eleanor feel safer. "Any man who forces himself on a woman is my business," he said quietly, his voice carrying more threat than any shout. "I suggest you leave now, before I forget my manners." His hands hung loose at his sides, but Eleanor could see the coiled tension in his shoulders. Samuel's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. "You'll regret this interference," he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at Thomas. "I own half this town, and I'll make sure you never work another day in these mountains." But his threats rang hollow as he backed toward the door, his courage failing him completely in the face of Thomas's quiet determination. After Samuel's footsteps faded down the stairs, Thomas turned to Eleanor with gentle concern. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice soft now, the earlier steel replaced by tender worry. Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face as the reality of her situation crashed over her. She was trapped in a town where her intended husband had just shown his true nature. "I can't marry him," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "But I have nowhere else to go. I used all my savings for the journey here, and there's no one back in Philadelphia who would take me in." The admission of her complete vulnerability hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt his heart break for this brave woman who had traveled so far, seeking a better life. Thomas knelt beside her chair, his calloused hands gentle as he offered her his handkerchief. "There's always a choice," he said quietly. "It might not be easy, but there's always a choice." His brown eyes were earnest, and Eleanor found herself trusting this stranger in a way she'd never trusted Samuel, despite months of correspondence. "I don't even know your name," Eleanor said, accepting the handkerchief and dabbing at her tears. The simple act of kindness from this rugged man meant more to her than all of Samuel's polished courtesies. She studied his face in the moonlight, noting the kindness in his eyes and the honest strength in his weathered features. "Thomas McKenna," he replied, a slight smile softening his features. "I work the timber claims up in the mountains. I've been watching over you from afar, miss, ever since you arrived. Something about Samuel Garrett never sat right with me." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "If you need help, I'm willing to provide it." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never seen in Samuel's calculated gaze. Genuine caring without expectation of return. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." But even as she spoke, She felt a connection to this gentle giant that defied explanation. His presence calmed her in a way that Samuel's never had. "Because it's the right thing to do," Thomas said simply, "and because I've read your letters." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise, and Thomas's face reddened with embarrassment. "I work part-time at the post office, sorting mail. I couldn't help but notice your handwriting, and Samuel, well, he's not known for his discretion. He showed your letters to anyone who'd listen." Yeah, the admission hung between them, and Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment that her private thoughts had been shared so carelessly. But looking at Thomas's honest face, she realized that he'd seen something in her words that Samuel had missed entirely. Where Samuel had seen compliance and submission, Thomas had recognized her spirit and intelligence. "What did you think of them?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Thomas's eyes lit up with warmth, and his smile transformed his rugged features into something almost handsome. The moonlight streaming through the window cast shadows that emphasized the strong lines of his jaw and the gentle curve of his lips. "I thought they were beautiful," Thomas said honestly. "You wrote about wanting a partnership, not just a marriage, about loving the land and finding peace in simple things." Samuel never understood that part. His voice carried a longing that made Eleanor's heart race. "I've been living alone in these mountains for years, and your words made me realize how much I wanted to share that life with someone who could appreciate it." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes again, but these were different tears, tears of recognition and hope. "You live alone in the mountains?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The idea of escaping to the wilderness, away from Samuel's controlling presence and the judgmental eyes of the townspeople, seemed like a dream too good to be true. Thomas nodded, his expression growing more animated as he spoke. "I have a cabin about 10 miles up the mountain, in a grove of pines near a clear stream. It's simple, but it's peaceful. The air is clean, and you can see for miles across the valley. I've been building it up slowly, hoping someday to—" He trailed off, realizing he was revealing too much of his dreams. "Hoping to what?" Eleanor pressed, leaning forward in her chair. Something in Thomas's description stirred her soul in a way that Samuel's promises of a comfortable life in town never had. She'd grown up in the cramped, sooty streets of Philadelphia, always dreaming of open spaces and clean air. This man was offering her something she'd never dared to hope for. "Hoping to share it with someone who could love it as much as I do," Thomas admitted, his voice barely audible. "Someone who understands that happiness doesn't come from owning things, but from appreciating what you have." His eyes met hers, and Eleanor felt a spark of connection that took her breath away. This was what she'd been seeking, without knowing it. The sound of voices in the hallway interrupted their conversation, and both Eleanor and Thomas froze. Samuel's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, talking to someone about the wedding preparations. Eleanor's stomach clenched with renewed fear, and Thomas saw the panic return to her eyes. The spell of their intimate conversation was broken by the harsh reality of her situation. "I have to leave," Eleanor whispered urgently. "I can't go through with the wedding, but if I stay, Samuel will force me." Her hands shook as she reached for her satchel, her movements frantic and desperate. The idea of spending her life with a man who would take what he wanted by force was unbearable. Thomas stood, his decision made. "Then don't stay," he said firmly. "Come with me, tonight. I know these mountains better than anyone, and Samuel won't be able to follow us in the dark." The offer hung between them, bold and dangerous. Eleanor looked at this man who was offering her everything she'd dreamed of, and more. "I barely know you," Eleanor protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Everything in her heart told her to trust this gentle giant who had already shown her more kindness than Samuel ever had. The alternative, a life of subjugation and fear, seemed far more dangerous than running into the unknown with Thomas. "You know me better than you think," Thomas said gently. "You've been writing to me for months, even if you didn't know it. Every letter you sent to Samuel was really meant for someone like me, someone who could appreciate your spirit and your dreams." His words rang true, and Eleanor felt the rightness of his offer in her bones. Eleanor looked around the small room that had become her prison, then back at Thomas's honest face. "How do I know you won't turn out to be just like Samuel?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. The betrayal of Samuel's true nature had shaken her faith in her own judgment, and the thought of making another mistake was terrifying. Thomas stepped back, giving her space to breathe and think. "You don't," he said honestly, "but I'm not asking you to marry me tonight. I'm offering you a choice. Freedom to decide your own future, whether that's with me or somewhere else entirely." His integrity shone through his words, and Eleanor felt her last reservations crumble. "What about my belongings?" Eleanor asked, looking at her trunk in the corner. Thomas followed her gaze and shook his head. "We can't take much without arousing suspicion. Pack only what you can carry in your satchel." The reality of leaving everything behind hit Eleanor, but she realized that most of her possessions were reminders of a life she was happy to leave behind. Eleanor quickly packed her few precious items, her mother's locket, a small Bible, and a change of clothes. As she moved around the room, Thomas kept watch at the door, listening for any sign that Samuel might return. The boarding house had grown quiet, but they both knew that discovery would mean disaster for Eleanor and possibly violence for Thomas. "Ready?" Thomas whispered, and Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding with fear and excitement. They crept down the back stairs, avoiding the creaky boards that Thomas had memorized during his occasional visits to town. The night air was cool against Eleanor's face, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the boarding house. Thomas led her to a small stable behind the boarding house where he'd left his horse and pack mule. The animals nickered softly in recognition, and Thomas spoke to them in soothing tones as he prepared for their journey. Eleanor watched him work, noting the gentle way he handled the animals and the quiet efficiency of his movements. "Can you ride?" Thomas asked, helping Eleanor onto the horse. She nodded, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted upon during her childhood. The horse was gentle and well-trained, responding to her touch with calm acceptance. Thomas mounted behind her, his strong arms encircling her waist as he took the reins. They rode through the sleeping town in silence, the only sounds the soft clop of hooves on packed earth and the distant howl of a coyote. Eleanor felt the weight of her decision with each step that took her further from the life she'd planned and closer to an uncertain future. But Thomas's steady presence behind her gave her courage to face whatever lay ahead. As they reached the edge of town, Eleanor looked back at the cluster of buildings that had briefly been her home. Somewhere in one of those structures, Samuel Garrett slept peacefully, unaware that his bride had vanished into the night. By morning, the entire town would know of her flight, and she wondered what stories they would tell about the mail-order bride who had run away. The mountain trail was steep and treacherous in the darkness, but Thomas guided their horse with sure instincts born of years of experience. Eleanor marveled at his knowledge of every rock and route, every twist and turn that led them higher into the wilderness. The air grew cooler and cleaner with each mile, and she felt her spirits lift despite the uncertainty of her situation. "Are you cold?" Thomas asked, noticing Eleanor's slight shiver. Before she could answer, he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and she was enveloped in the warm scent of pine and honest sweat. The gesture was so thoughtful and natural that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. When had anyone ever put her comfort before their own, so instinctively? They rode for hours through the dark forest, following paths that seemed invisible to Eleanor, but were clearly familiar to Thomas. The moon filtered through the canopy of trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the forest floor. Night sounds surrounded them, the rustle of small animals, the hoot of an owl, the distant splash of water over rocks. As dawn approached, they crested a ridge, and Eleanor gasped at the view before them. The valley spread out below like a green carpet, dotted with wildflowers and crossed by a silver ribbon of stream. Thomas's cabin sat in a grove of tall pines, smoke rising from its chimney into the clear morning air. It was more beautiful than anything Eleanor had imagined. "Welcome home," Thomas said softly, and Eleanor felt the rightness of his words in her heart. This was home. Not the boarding house in town, not the cramped apartment in Philadelphia, but this peaceful sanctuary where she could finally breathe freely. The cabin was simple but well built, with a covered porch and windows that would let in the morning light. Thomas helped her down from the horse, his hands gentle but strong. Eleanor's legs were shaky from the long ride, and she was grateful for his steady support. As they walked toward the cabin, she noticed the care he'd taken with his property. A small vegetable garden, split firewood stacked neatly under the eaves, and wildflowers growing in a patch of cleared ground. "It's not much," Thomas said, suddenly self-conscious about his simple home. "But it's clean and warm, and there's plenty of room for—" He stopped, realizing he was assuming she would stay. Eleanor saw his uncertainty and felt her heart go out to this man who had risked everything to help her without asking for anything in return. "It's perfect," Eleanor said, meaning every word. The cabin represented everything she'd dreamed of: peace, simplicity, and the freedom to be herself. Thomas's face lit up with relief and happiness, and Eleanor realized that her approval meant more to him than any material wealth ever could. This was a man who found joy in sharing simple pleasures. Inside, the cabin was even more welcoming than Eleanor had hoped. Thomas had clearly spent years making it comfortable, with handmade furniture, colorful quilts, and shelves lined with books. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. It was a home, built with love and care, waiting for someone to share it. "I'll sleep in the barn while you're here," Thomas said, his face reddening with embarrassment. "I don't want you to feel, that is, I don't expect—" He struggled to find the right words, and Eleanor realized he was trying to assure her that she was safe with him. The contrast with Samuel's aggressive assumptions could not have been more stark. Eleanor turned to face him fully, studying his honest face in the morning light streaming through the windows. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I need you to know that I'm not the same woman who wrote those letters to Samuel. She was looking for security and comfort. I'm looking for something more." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Thomas's eyes searched her face, hope and uncertainty warring in their depths. "What are you looking for?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine the course of both their lives. She thought of Samuel's grabbing hands and Thomas's gentle strength, of the town's judgment and the mountain's freedom. "I'm looking for a partner," Eleanor said, stepping closer to Thomas. "Someone who sees me as an equal, not a possession. Someone who wants to build a life together, not just acquire a wife." She saw understanding dawn in Thomas's eyes, and her heart began to race with the possibilities that lay before them. Thomas reached out slowly, giving Eleanor every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he gently cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. "I've been waiting for you my whole life," he whispered. "Not the woman in those letters, but the woman standing here now, the one brave enough to choose her own path." Eleanor felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she realized that she had found something she'd never dared to hope for, a man who loved her for her strength, not her submission. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose to be here with you." Thomas's kiss was gentle and sweet, tasting of hope and new beginnings. Eleanor felt her heart soar as she kissed him back, knowing that she was finally home. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, and a hawk circled overhead, crying its wild song of freedom. Eleanor had found her place in the world at last, Months later, as Eleanor worked in her garden while Thomas chopped wood for the winter, she reflected on the choice that had brought her to this moment. She had come west, seeking security, and found something far more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. The mountains had given her the freedom to become who she was meant to be. The sound of hoofbeats on the trail below caught their attention, and Eleanor shaded her eyes to see a lone rider approaching. Thomas set down his axe and moved protectively toward his wife, but Eleanor recognized the rider and smiled. It was Pastor Williams from the next valley over, come to check on the newlyweds, as he did every few weeks. "Mrs. McKenna," the pastor called out as he dismounted, "you're looking well. Mountain life agrees with you." Eleanor smiled at the title she'd chosen for herself, having married Thomas in a simple ceremony under the stars, with only the pastor and a few neighbors as witnesses. It had been more meaningful than any church wedding could have been. "It does indeed, Pastor," Eleanor replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thomas and I were just discussing our plans for next spring's planting." She gestured toward the expanded garden they'd planned together, their voices mingling in perfect harmony as they described their shared vision for their mountain home. As the pastor departed and evening fell, Eleanor and Thomas sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley. The peace of their mountain sanctuary surrounded them, and Eleanor marveled at how different her life had become from what she'd planned. She had found something far better than the security she'd sought. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Leaving everything behind for this simple life?" Eleanor considered the question, thinking of the comfortable existence she might have had in town, the social position as Samuel's wife, the material comforts she'd given up. "Never," Eleanor said firmly, turning to kiss her husband's cheek. "I didn't leave everything behind. I found everything I ever really wanted." The truth of her words settled over them like a warm blanket, and they sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. The story of Eleanor and Thomas McKenna became legend in the mountains, passed down through generations as a tale of true love triumphing over convention. Their descendants still live in the valley, carrying on the tradition of choosing love over convenience, freedom over security, and partnership over possession. Now, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think Eleanor made the right choice in following her heart over her practical plans? Have you ever had to choose between security and your dreams? Share your thoughts on this tale of courage and true love from the old